The next grammatical concept we're going to be taking a look at is punctuation, because punctuation defines how your ideas fit together. So we need to have accurate punctuation so that the reader can understand clearly how your ideas fit together. Most of this video will deal with the comma, but let's just get some easy stuff out of the way first. The three easiest punctuation marks to understand are the period, the question mark, and the exclamation point. Obviously, periods are used at the end of statements, question marks are used at the end of questions, and exclamation points are used at the end of exclamations. Pretty easy. Now, in formal writing, you want to avoid using exclamation points because it's mostly an informal punctuation mark. Let's start with the most common punctuation mark, and that's the comma. Commas are also very misunderstood. For example, you may have had someone tell you, just put a comma wherever you pause in a sentence. That is wrong. There are rules to govern where and when you should use a comma. So let's take a look at some of those rules. Rule number 1. Use commas to separate items in a series. For example, Haley went to the store and brought milk, bread, and eggs. So you have a series of 3 things and you use commas to separate them. Pretty easy. And pretty common, and you probably knew that already. However, you might not know that this comma here is called the Oxford comma, and there's actually a lot of debate about it. People say that if you have a series of 3 things, then the word "and" separates the last 2, and you don't really need that comma. I would disagree, and I would fight to the death anyone who fights me on that. You need this comma. It adds clarity. For instance, let's look at this second sentence. I dedicate this award to my parents, Debbie and Phil. Now, if I don't believe in the Oxford comma, then I don't put a comma there. But what if I'm not trying to thank my parents whose names are Debbie and Phil? What if I'm trying to thank my parents as one thing, Debbie, who is not one of my parents, is a second thing, and then Phil is also not one of my parents? I'm trying to thank my parents, and separate from my parents also I'm trying to thank Debbie and Phil. I need that comma. It adds clarity. It makes things clear. It's important to punctuate so that the reader doesn't struggle to understand exactly what you mean. But anyway, commas separate items in a series or list. Comma use number 2. Use a comma before a conjunction when linking 2 independent clauses. Just as a reminder, an independent clause can stand as a sentence by itself. So let's look at this example. Jake is sick of his friends having a crush on his older sister, but he is downright disgusted when they start checking out his mother. All right, we have 2 independent clauses. We could stop the sentence here. Jake is sick of his friends having a crush on his older sister. That's an independent clause. It could stand by itself as a sentence. Also this starting here. He's downright disgusted when they start checking out his mother. That could be a sentence by itself. But we can link those 2 things with a comma plus conjunction. But you need that comma. The conjunction by itself is not strong enough. Conjunctions are strong enough to link dependent clauses to independent clauses, but not 2 independent clauses. Likewise, the comma by itself would not be strong enough to link these 2 ideas. It needs the conjunction. But these 2 things together can link independent clauses. But that is another use of the comma. Comma use number 3. Use a comma to separate a dependent clause from an independent clause if the dependent clause comes first. So as I just said, commas are strong enough to link dependent clauses to independent clauses. So if we look at this, after they left the house, Katie realized the garage was wide open. So this is a dependent clause. After they left the house, that could not be a sentence by itself, so it's a dependent clause. It also has a noun and a verb, so that makes it a clause. And then this starting here is an independent clause. Katie realized the garage was wide open. That could stand as a sentence by itself. A comma links dependent clauses to independent clauses if the dependent clause came first. Imagine that this phrase came after this. Katie realized the garage was wide open after they left the house. You would not put a comma. So if the dependent clause comes after the independent clause, you don't need a comma. But if it comes before, you need that comma right there. Number 4. When starting a sentence with certain adverbs, words like however, therefore, nevertheless, moreover, words like that you might use in formal essays, use a comma after that adverb. So in this first example, however, comma, those foods make him gassy. Pretty simple. If you're using that adverb in the middle of the sentence, like the second example, those foods, however, make him gassy, you would have commas on both sides. Comma use number 5. Use comma to separate any inessential word or phrase from the rest of the sentence. So first example, after dinner, if you don't mind, I will be leaving for home. Now, we don't really need this phrase. It doesn't add anything important to the sentence. It's just sort of a polite requesting kind of phrase. But the sentence could be, after dinner, I will be leaving for home. So because we don't really need this, we'll separate it from the sentence with commas, which kind of tells the reader to put this idea aside. Now in the second example, Gerald, glaring at John with fury, did not like guys talking to his girlfriend. So Gerald is the subject, did not like is the verb. So this part here is not really necessary to the sentence. It just adds a little bit of color to it. But because it's unnecessary, we separate it with commas. Comma use number 6. Use commas between some adjectives. This can get a little confusing, but I'll try to make it simple. Example, LeBron James is fast, powerful, and intelligent. So we would use commas to separate those adjectives from each other. Likewise in the next one, my wife made a moist, delicious cake. We would use a comma to separate the two adjectives. But you don't always do that, because sometimes it wouldn't make sense. Look at this next one. I bought a black baseball glove. Now, glove here is my noun, and baseball is an adjective, and black is an adjective. In this case, baseball is an adjective because it's describing the kind of glove, the color of the glove. So the way to decide if you need commas in between the adjectives is you can imagine the word and if you can imagine the word and between the adjectives, then a comma goes there. LeBron James is fast and powerful and intelligent. That makes sense. My wife made a moist and delicious cake. That makes sense. I bought a black and baseball glove. That does not make sense, so comma does not go there. And the last comma use. Use a comma before a quote. A lot of people don't do this. It gets really annoying. I have to put in the commas in a lot of essays. According to Dr. Hillary, comma, yearly checkups went out with the Stone Age. Second example, Bob Dylan once said, comma, he not busy being born is busy dying. So you want to put a comma to sort of give the reader a little bit of a clue that the quote is coming right now, and it separates the introduction of the quote from the quote itself. And that's it for commas. A lot of this stuff is common sense. You already knew it probably, but it's good to realize that there actually are rules that determine when you should use commas. So we'll see you next time with our next punctuation mark, the colon.